welcome back to part 2 of what gear do I need to get into wing foiling, or now we can really talk about foiling and SUP foiling itself as well, because we are going to be talking about boards and foils in this part 2 video. Yes, understanding about the foils and what boards you should be looking at, whether you want to get into wing foiling for the first time or maybe even transition onto SUP surf foiling as well. So just like in part 1, I'm going to explain what we've learnt and found out over several years of using foils, because after all, if you can understand why these foils and boards are designed the way they are, that's going to let you find the best board and foil for you. So we're going to break this video down into a few sections again. First off, we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about non-foiling boards. What type of boards should you be looking at to get on with a wing, not using a foil? Then we're going to move on to foiling boards, the shapes, designs, specifications, what you should be looking at, what boards are going to be easy to use, and then we're going to be talking about foils, everything around foils, the main foil front wing, the size, the shape, the design, the mast length, the fuselage. We're going to go over all of those things. And also, I will say there is some really good information on the internet, some really good videos made by maybe the designers of the foils in particular, that will give you some really good information if you're after those more technical questions and really how the foils really work. Definitely search out some of those videos. In this video, we're going to give you more of a basic look. We're still going to talk about how the foils work, but try not to get too techy, to keep it more of a intermediate beginner level so you can really take it all in and learn from it. So first off, let's clear all these foils away and focus on boards first. So first off, now let's talk about non-foiling boards, because probably a lot of you are going to come into the wing surfing, wing dinging, whatever you want to call it, side of the sport using a non-foiling board to start with. And it's a really good place to start because it allows you to really understand about how to use the wing and get your tacks and your jibes sorted out, managing to stay upwind, and then you can transition onto a foil board and it will be a lot easier because you won't have to worry about using the wing because you've already mastered that, and then you can focus on just using the board. Now obviously there's two routes here. You've got inflatable boards and you've got composite hard boards. Now just remember, you can get into winging with almost any board as long as you can stand on it, but definitely there are going to be some boards which are going to lend themselves to be easier to stay upwind and stop you drifting downwind, which is going to be the most common thing that happens to you when you start wing surfing. There's a lot of brands now that are actually making specific non-foiling wing boards, like Ensis, which we're using in our SUPboarder Pro test at the moment, where they've got two mini side fins on the side there which stop the board from going downwind. If you have an inflatable paddleboard or a hard paddleboard already, but you want to install these types of fins on your board, you can actually do that with systems such as drift stoppers, which go around your board, clip underneath, and help that board exactly the same as if it was a purpose-made board as well. Generally, the more fins you have on your board, the bigger the fin as well, the better you are going to be able to keep yourself at moving upwind. As far as a board is concerned itself, size-wise, it's going to be a board that you're comfortable to stand on. And as I said, a lot of you maybe already have this board in your quiver, 10.6 by 32 inches, something that's nice and floaty and easy to stand on. It is worth mentioning that if you do use your wing in windier conditions and you go out with a hard composite board, which will have more rail shape at the back of the board and a thin down rail compared to an inflatable paddleboard, it is going to be easier to bite and grip and even plane with your board. Much more like a windsurfer then, you're using the planing surface of the back of the board, and a hard composite board will respond much better than an inflatable paddleboard when it gets windy with your windsurfer. Moving on to foil boards, that is where it can get a little bit more technical, and sizes and dimensions do make a bigger difference. First thing you've got to decide is, do you want to go down an inflatable route, because there's a lot of inflatable boards out there, or do you want to go down a composite hardboard carbon glass fiber route? Now obviously having an inflatable board is much better to store. Surprisingly, stiffness isn't actually one of the main concerns when it comes to buying an inflatable foil board, because a lot of them are fairly short. You will find the biggest thing is the bottom shape and design the brands can put on their composite boards, which they can't put on their inflatable paddleboards, and that does make them easier to use when it comes to surf or wing foiling. So now let's move on to foil boxes. You're going to have to decide on two types of foil box. You have a deep tuttle box, which was sort of common when foiling with SUPs and surfing came out very much in the early days. The windsurfing market has still got deep tuttle boxes with their foils, but now for most of us, probably 95% of brands have all gone down this double US box route, which you're probably familiar. It's under a lot of paddleboards, surfboards, but you've usually got one. Well, here they've placed two side by side. This is pretty much the norm now. Most brands are using this, and it's very easy setup to put on your board. Now if we move on to outline shapes, now you can relate this to inflatable paddleboards and composite boards still, because you still can change the outline shape of an inflatable paddleboard. Obviously, a wider, thicker nose you're going to have, and a wider, thicker, squarer tail is going to give that board that much more stability. But it's going to draw back the performance sense, because you're going to have more weight or more volume up at the nose and at the tail of the board. Therefore, smaller boards are always going to perform better, but they're going to be harder to stand on. Wider, fatter boards are going to have a little bit less performance, but they're going to be much easier to stand on. When it comes to the length of the board, the longer the board, just like with paddleboarding or surfing, the more glide, the more speed you're going to have, but only when you're not on the foil. So obviously, if you're paddling into waves, if you're learning to SUP foil, a longer base board with a bit more length to it is going to be easier to catch the wave and get you up onto the foil. And it is actually the same with wing foiling as well, but if you have a shorter board, you will find it easier to pump the board up on to the foil using the wing as well. So a shorter board can help, but it's a little bit more beneficial for a more intermediate foiler than the real beginner foilers. Generally, lengths of boards are sitting around 6'5". There are smaller base boards out there, and there definitely are some maybe longer base boards at 7 foot. The downside with going for a longer base board, when you're in the air flying on your foil, all of that board in front of your front foot is a complete waste unless you touch down and you need to pop yourself back up again. Length of the board is really not needed when you are foiling, and definitely when you get to the intermediate level and you're not breaching and going up and down on the foil all the time, the length of the board can be cut down drastically. When it comes to width, it's still fairly important. You can actually go for a wider board when you're up on the foil, and it won't make any difference at all to the riding characteristics of the board. But when you're not on the foil, having a wider board will slow you down to paddle on to surf or to get up onto your foil with your wing. There are lots of different board widths out there, but just bear in mind a wider board will give you more stability but be slower to paddle, and a narrow board will be faster to paddle or get up onto the foil but be less stable. Obviously, bring length and width together, you get volume, which is how much area is inside of the board. The more volume you have, the more float the board is going to have. If you're a heavier base rider, you are going to be looking at having a higher volume board. And if you are a lighter rider, you're going to be looking at a lower volume board. A big thing to talk about here is you see a lot of really cool videos of guys busting big airs and freestyle moves, and they're on tiny little, maybe 45-litre boards. Now that's a great side of the sport, and it's going to be getting smaller and smaller, no doubt. But if the wind drops, you are going to sink. You cannot get back in. You can't even paddle back in on your belly. Some of these boards are so small. So when it comes to buying a wing board for your foiling, a strong thing I would say is always look at a board that's floaty enough so if the wind drops, you can get yourself back in. My go-to board is a board like this Nash here. It's 95 litres. It's really easy to stand on for me at 75 kilos. That means I have 20 litres spare volume until the board sinks. So I can still get back upwind if the wind drops. If the wind goes all together, I can deflate my wing. I can paddle back home with this, no problem at all. The other thing as well, because if you're buying a board for your winging, you might as well look at doing it for SUP, surf foiling as well, because then you can increase your water time by doing extra disciplines. So if you are getting into windsurfing, definitely look at getting a board that you can SUP, surf foil as well. Really will increase your water time, and it will be even more value for money when you're getting into this sport. When it comes to board weights, it is a fairly important thing to think about, especially if you're looking at those longer base boards that maybe you want to get into SUP surfing. If you have a 7-foot board and your board weighs 10 kilos, that's a lot of weight that's going to be hanging out the front of your front foot that you're going to have to counteract and balance with your foil. Therefore, if you have a lighter base board, you're going to have less weight at the nose, and it's going to make it easier for you to ride and trim your weight forward and back with your front and back leg. Now let's talk bottom shape. So what does all this bottom shape do and why is it important? Well, when you start to wing surf or foil surf, whatever you're doing, you're going to be basically doing a bit of yo-yoing up and down, a bit of breaching. You're going to be basically riding up onto the foil and coming back down, riding up onto the foil and coming back down. And that's just because you haven't felt the feeling of flying before, and it's going to take you a while to get used to it. So all the boards are designed to set up to help you get onto the foil as easy as possible. And also when you come back down and you hit or contact the water again, the boards don't catch and stick or pull you back down and knock you off your board. So they try and keep the flow of the board up around the shoulders as smooth as possible so you don't catch. So for that reason, that's why they have a small amount of rocker up at the nose so you don't nosedive, but there's big bevel rails on all of these boards. There's big bevel rails where they come in, and as the board touches down, it doesn't catch and the water doesn't wrap around the top of the nose of the board or the side of the board, because that would in effect grab you and pull you back down from the water, and it would stop you dead as you would move that back down onto the water as well. So they have much wider, thicker boards in general with much more beveled, rounded, voluminous rails up at the front, and they generally carry on back through the midsection of the board as well, because you might touch down more in the middle part of the board, and again, you don't want that water wrapping around that board and pulling you down. And that's the difference between if you got your old surfing SUP and you've got a local shaper to put some fin boxes in it, put some 2 US fin boxes in it and put your foil on it. That's the big difference. When you come down on those base boards, they're going to be thinner in the rails, and as you hit down on the water's going to wrap around the rails and you're going to stop pretty quick, and you're not going to be able to regain and keep your speed and pop back onto the foil nice and easily. Definitely we've noticed that in the last year and a half, 2 years or 3 years since we started SUP foiling. The big development has been around the board shapes themselves and how much smoother they are when you come down off of your foil. Lots of board brands have got channels, maybe like this one down the center. Some have got deeper channels down the sides. The channels are there for a few reasons. One, if you're still talking about coming back down on the foil and hitting on the water, they give you a bit of grip to keep the board going straight, because you don't want the foil board to land and then start going sideways a little bit, because then obviously you're going to have more chance of falling off. So they keep the board going straight. Also, when you're paddling in, maybe catching a wave or getting up with your wing for the first time, they will generate water towards the back, forcing it a little bit in the center, giving a bit of lift, and obviously giving you that more straight line tracking as well. So they're there to give you forward stability and to give you a little bit more lift when you're not on the foil yet. But really the first thing we noticed when we got into SUP foiling especially is the back of the boards were really important, how they made a difference to how early you could get up onto the foil. With wings foiling, it's a little bit less important because you generally can just ride up onto the foil and you've got the power of the wing to help you. But if you're trying to get up in lighter winds, the back of the board and where the foil box are placed is really important to getting the most out of your board, and definitely a light wind session. So by them cutting off the back of the board, but all of the boards having cut off tails with less volume, it means that when you push the board back in the water, the tail can sink and you can initiate the foil more, and you can bring the foil out of the water earlier. If you had more volume back here, a more flatter area behind the foil fin boxes, as you push down on the back of the board will want to push you back up and not engage your foil. A quick note on the US box placement of where they put it on the board and how big they are. Most brands are settling around 10-inch US box placement from front to back. JP Australia, I think they still do have longer US box placements in their board. I personally think longer placements, longer boxes are actually really good because it gives you more area to move your foil around. But I suppose if you're getting into SUP foiling or wing surfing, you might not know exactly where you want to put your foil, so having a smaller base box will narrow down where you do that. The box itself, just as you know, the further forward you put your foil, the more lift or the earlier lighter wind you're going to get up in, and the further back you put your foil, the more control you're going to have, and the better it's going to be when it gets windier if you're wing foiling or if you're surfing in bigger waves. So forward, more lift, back, less lift. That's just a quick summary on that. The next thing we're going to talk about is something that we get asked a lot on SUPboarder. Foot straps. Should I use foot straps? What do we think of foot straps? What foot strap setup is best? Where do you start? Now, it can be a bit of a minefield, and definitely if you haven't come from a sport where you've used foot straps before, like windsurfing, kite surfing, foot straps can seem quite scary to a lot of people. Now, we've sent a lot of people out with foot straps when they've learned to wing foil, and without foot straps when we've learned to wing foil. So we've done a little experiment with people. The general consensus is still it's easier to learn with foot straps because they give you a really good idea of where your foot placement should be on the board. And after all, when you're SUP foiling, whether you're on the surf or getting into winging, foot placement is the most important thing to have nailed down. If your feet in the wrong place, you will fall off before we even get up onto the foil. I find that using foot straps allows me to get way more control when I'm on my board. It allows me to stay on the board more, maybe when I would have fallen off without foot straps, and to pump and get up early, whether on a wave or using my wing. Foot straps is way more efficient at getting the board up on the foil early. But honestly, it is a complete personal preference. If you do not like the idea of putting your feet in foot straps, or you've had maybe ankle injuries in the past and you don't want to go anywhere near enclosing your foot in something, then obviously go without foot straps. But I would urge you, I do think it's easier to start off and get going with foot straps. As far as foot strap placement is concerned, let's answer a few of these questions. So first off, you can see there's two boards here. You've got this Gong inflatable board and you've got this Nash board here. The Gong inflatable board is sort of more, let's call it a windsurf traditional offset foot straps, both angled out from the center there. Generally, that is a very nice foot strap setup for winging because you're slightly over to one rail a little bit more, and you find it a little bit easier having your foot sprayed forward. The other popular foot strap placement is where you have a foot strap along the center line. I personally like this foot strap more because then it's better when I want to transition into surf. I do like having my feet directly over the center line of the board. Now, there are loads of different combinations. You can have it slightly offset, you can have two in the center, you can have it, like I said, the more traditional windsurf based setup. The choices are out there. The one thing I will say is when you're buying a board, definitely look at the boards that have got foot strap plugs, as I said, but also have got more angles, more offset positions that you could put them in. Even if you're not going to be using them and you're saying, I'm not using foot straps, you might change your mind. And if you've spent all your money and you've got a board without foot straps, I do think it's worth an investment in getting one that has got the foot strap plugs all in place. So in an ideal world, this Nash would have extra foot strap plugs up here and up here, so then I could ride it if I wanted to like that, but I can't at the moment, so it has to stay in that position there. And most boards that come with foot straps as standard or foot strap plugs have got rear foot straps as well, except this Gong one here you see has not got a rear foot strap. It's just got the two front foot straps. The Nash and then the Cabrina and the JP, all the other boards you've got, they have got a back foot strap as well. I have heard some people that just use a front foot strap in general, and even if they've got a back strap they don't put it on, and that's a personal preference thing again. I will say, out of my sort of history of using a lot of straps in the past with kitesurfing and windsurfing, I've had a lot less injuries when both my feet have been in the straps and I've fallen off and taken a hammering. If I have one foot out of the strap, that's when my body can twist, and that's when I have had more potential, when I have had twisted ankles and stuff like that. So having both feet in the straps, I would say, is better, definitely when it comes to falling off, than having one foot in the strap. But not having a back strap does allow you to move your foot around on the back of the board, and if you're using it with a more traditional windsurf or wing surfing offset strap placement, that can be beneficial, not having a center back strap. There's loads of different types of foot straps you can get on the market, and as with all brands, they're going to be coming up with loads of stuff that they can sell you, different things, different footing attachments, different types of straps, and we will be looking at more of those in the future. If you've got any personal feedback about your foot straps and how you're finding them, what ones you finding the best, if you've learned which did you find it easier with foot straps or without, please let us know in the comments section below. It's a personal preference thing. Give it a go, let us know your thoughts. But buying a board with foot straps and plugs is definitely a good idea if you can. So I hope you're with me still. Now we're going to move on to the foils. Yes, we're going to be getting a little bit more technical, but get a beer, get a cup of tea, and let's get through this together. And hopefully at the end of it, you will know exactly what's going on underneath your board. foils, what is it all about? What's going on? Where do we start? Okay, the first thing I will say is I will use the word wing quite a bit, and I don't mean wingy dingy thingy, jellyfish thing you hold on to. I mean wing, as in the front wing of your foil. A lot of people, you'll see a lot of videos on the internet, they'll be talking about foil wings, and they actually mean this part of the wing as opposed to that part of the wings. I know, a little bit confusing. So the first thing we're going to talk about is the sizes of your front wing, because that really makes a difference to how early you get up on the foil and how fast you go on the foil as well. If you want a bigger front wing, the more area you have, let's move this one out of the way, the more area you have on a wing, this part of the wing, remember, the earlier you're going to get up. Therefore, if you're a bigger person, if you weigh more, or if you want to get up in lighter winds or on smaller waves, you are going to need a bigger front wing. This is my sort of standard go-to wing for a bit of all-round easy going. It's an 1800 square centimeter area front wing. Most wings are measured in wingspan, you can get the depth and all that sort of stuff, but the real measurement I think you should be focusing on is the overall area. So if you hear the numbers 1800, 1500, 1100, 1000, they're all really talking around the area of the wing. I will warn you, when you get into foiling and you watch videos and you read reviews and stuff, you will be reading and hearing a lot of numbers, and it can get a little bit confusing, especially if they end up saying them really quickly. So I apologize if I do that myself. So this is an 1800 square centimeter area front wing. This will get me up in light winds with my wing foil. As I said in another video, some people didn't believe me, but if I work this, I can get up at 9 knots with a 4-meter wing, and I'm 75 kilos. If you are a heavier person and you are looking to get up in the same sort of winds, you're obviously going to need a bigger wing, like I said in the last video, maybe a 6-meter, and you want to increase your front wing of the foil to around a 2000, maybe 2100, which is more surface area, and it's going to give you more lift. The basic principle how a hydrofoil works, now there are some really good technical videos online, and there's a few arguments about how it exactly works, but basically this is an airplane wing underwater. It's exactly the same. You're traveling along, the water hits the bottom of the foil and it increases and makes lift and pushes you upwards. There are some very good technical explanations that people can argue about how exactly it does it, but that's basically how it is. It's a wing underwater. The bigger it is, the more lift you get. So what's the downside to having a bigger front wing? Why should anybody ever have a smaller front wing? After all, what's wrong with getting up on the foil nice and early? Well, the downside to having a big front wing is it's not going to be as fast when it gets windy or you're catching bigger waves. So therefore, you're going to find that there's going to be a bit of a lower top end speed. And in a lot of cases, you will find that when this wing gets really at that top end speed, it will want to take off. You will not be able to control it, definitely at the beginner level, and you'll find that your wing will start to breach out of the water. You will start to porpoise. You will start to launch yourself out of the water because your front wing of your foil is giving you too much lift. Now, if that's happening, the easiest thing to do is to decrease the size of your front wing to give you less lift. So just to give you a rough rundown of areas of wings to size of riders, I would say riders from 85 kilos to 100, 105 kilos should be looking at the 2000 square centimeter, maybe a bit more plus wings for their winging in lighter winds. And if they want to get going in a little bit windier conditions and not worried about getting up in those lighter winds, maybe more the 1800 like this wing here. If you're a moderate weight rider like myself, 75 kilos, let's say 70 kilos to 85 kilos, you could be looking at a 1500 centimeters front wing to a 1800 centimeter front wing like this one. Obviously the bigger the wing, the lighter wind you're going to get up in. If you're a lighter paddler, lighter rider, you want to go winging, you want to go sup foiling, I would say probably not go any smaller than 1200, probably more like 1200 to 1500 square centimeters would be a nice size for you to get into the side of the sport. Remember, we're talking about beginners here, we're talking about getting you up and foiling for the first time. And remember how I said with wings, with flying wings, how the bigger the wing, the more stability you have, generally the less twitchy it is. It's a bit the same with the foils as well. If you're having a longer, larger wing that you're maybe using in lighter winds or smaller waves, it's going to be more stable and feel more planted in the water than a shorter, narrower base wing would do. So it's exactly the same as wings in the air. A wider, bigger area wing will feel more stable when you're foiling, especially for the first time. But that's only one part of the wing, that's just the area. Let's move on to the depth or the profile of the wing. How thick is this front edge? The basics to it, the thicker the front edge, the lighter wind you're going to be able to get up, or the smaller waves you're going to get going in, the more lift that you're going to have. But again, that is what slows the wing down. That is what makes the top end less. Having less profile here is going to be able to make this wing go faster through the water and stay more controllable. But the thicker the wing, the more lift it's going to mean, and the easier as well it's going to be able to control as well, because the less likely it's going to want to turn up and down, the more planted it's going to feel and go through the water. So when you're starting off, having a thicker wing is a bit easier to use than having a thinner base wing. If we look at these other wings here from Starboard, these are some of their new wings that are coming out. This is the E-type. It's a thinner base wing up here, so it's a bit of a compromise between the two. It's not as wide or as deep in the profile as the Axis here. It's a thinner wing, so it's going to be a better top end, maybe a bit more performance, but not as forgiving as having a deeper profile in the front there. So thicker profile, easiest to use, lower speed you're going to get up, but the top end speed is going to suffer, and it's not going to be so performance driven, which we'll speak about in a minute. Now I want to move on to high aspect ratio and low aspect ratio. Now you remember the chat we had with the wing video, similar sort of thing. We're going to be talking high aspect ratio, low aspect ratio. So here is a wing here, and here is another one from Axis, two wings, high aspect ratio, low aspect ratio, this one here. So high aspect ratio is a more performance wing. It's going to allow you to go faster and give you more control at top end speeds. Low aspect ratio, remember this one, is going to give you more lift. It's going to be a bit easier to use. It's going to not go to the higher end speed, and when it gets to the higher end speed, it might start to breach and give you too much lift. Also, bringing in the depth and the profile, let's put that one back a minute. This high aspect ratio wing has a much thinner profile, so it's going to be a little bit harder to get going, maybe a little bit more technical to use, but again, it's going to handle that speed. It's going to handle going faster because of the shape and also because of the depth. You will notice that high aspect ratio wings like this sort of shape are getting more and more popular at the moment. A couple of years ago, it was all about this sort of classic shape for a lot of people. The real advantages to these high aspect ratio foils is they allow you to move the front wing in and around the water so much quicker because you've got less depth. So pumping when you're moving your board up and down with your legs to generate speed and keep on the foil is a lot easier with a foil like this because there's less depth there and you can trim the foil up and down very quickly, and there's less profile in the front. So a high aspect ratio wing, just from the level point of view, you could be an intermediate foiler. You haven't got to be a really good foiler to get on a wing like this, but you have got to know how a foil works and how a foil reacts in the water. You can get up in light wind still with a foil like this compared to the other more traditional shape foil, but again, you're going to have to know how to work the board and pump the foil to initiate, to get that first bit of lift to get you going. So it's a little bit more technical to use, but it's got a much higher end performance, and a lot of people out there will be transitioning onto these types of foils into the future. The classic low aspect ratio wing is still the easiest to get up and going on, so if you're getting into wing foiling or surfing foiling for the first time, this is still the go-to foil. As I said earlier, it's got more of a bigger outline profile, it's a little bit more stable in the water. Having that thicker front edge makes it very easy for you to ride up onto the foil and not have to concentrate and think about how to use the foil. So from your first foiling steps or your first foiling flights, the low aspect ratio wings are still much easier to use, and definitely something that I would advise you looking at. So we've covered the overall area, the size of the wing, we've covered the depth of the profile, how deep it is, and we've also covered if it's a high aspect ratio or a low aspect ratio front foiling wing. Now, what about the curve of the wing. What about when you're looking at it like this? What is all going on with all this curving section here? Because this wing is curved and this wing is pretty much flat. There isn't much curve going on there at all. As I said, they're both about the same sort of width, but they do feel very different in the water. The easy way to explain it and understand it is if you put a curve in a wing, as you turn and bank your wing around, it changes the angle of how the water hits the bottom of the wing, and also it changes how much the wing potentially will come out of the water. If the water level is here and you're carving around, this wingtip is still in the water, which means it's really effective and it's giving you a good amount of control. If we take the same wing, this one, and we do the same maneuver, the water level is here, as it's coming around, you can then see the wingtip is actually coming out of the water, and that one on the starboard E-type was actually bent around, so it's still in the water. Now that's all well and good saying that in practice, but I know that a lot of top surfers out there, SUP foilers and foiling surfers, are breaching or getting their full wingtips to come out of the water and still carry on, but it means it's a little bit more technical to use. It means you're going to have to feel that wingtip as it comes around, so having a wing with more of a curve in the side is going to be easier for somebody who's not at that higher level. So the wingtips themselves, the more curved they are, the more support they're going to give you through your turns, and a slightly different feel they're going to give you when you're riding your board and carving it around turns. The other thing that's also worth looking at, which is probably more prominent in this one, which is this is actually an X-type wing, is the actual sort of gull shapes, the actual angles of the wings as they come off the sort of fuselage body. They're coming off at this angle. The further out, the more dihedral they have. When they go onto one side, that's going to be sticking out at this angle, which means it's going to give you more lift on the inside edge. It's going to keep the speed going. It's going to find it very easy to go from wingtip to wingtip, carve back and forth, which is why a lot of surfing foils have more dihedral in the more gull shape, which helps you carve from left to right. So if we look at this one here, is again the axis, you find that there's not much dihedral wing or gull shape at all. It's just a curve. The nice thing about having that curve is really easy and smooth. It's not going to catch you out. You can just carve around, carve back and forth. It's very smooth and easy. Again, more of a beginner entry level wing. It's got a nice bit of curve, but nothing drastic, no gull shapes, but it's going to suffer with the performance. Not going to be so high end, not so much speed, not going to give you that top end performance maybe with your pumping, but a lot easier to get going and up and foiling for the first time. Another thing that's worth noting about these flatter base wings is they might be really efficient and fast and nice for pumping and give you a good level of performance. Because they've got less curve in them like they have the more traditional axis there, they actually will start to, if you feel it, start to track sideways a tiny bit, and they find that they can do that easier than they can if they're curved. It's something that when you start riding these sort of wings, you'll notice they do start to track and feel a little less directional than a more traditional curved base wing. Another thing that separates this being more of an intermediate based wing opposed to the more classic curved base wing. I will say a word of warning or a caveat to back myself up on this, that wings are changing, as in foiling wings are changing a lot. Every 6 months there's a new wing coming out with a new design that somebody's coming up with. I know the Kiwis are really on it. There's a lot of really good designs coming out of New Zealand. Armstrong, Axis, there's loads of other good SUP brands coming out there. They're working a lot on wings, a lot of foiling wings, so there's a lot of action down in New Zealand. There's so much design coming out and it's happening so quickly. This might all totally change in 2 years, and all of what I've said so far might be total gobbledygook. Don't think it will be, but there will be compromises where this wing will transition into that wing. This wing may have flips on the tips there. This wing, maybe it'll come up the other way where he's saying, oh, the lower part of the turn, it gives it more support. There's loads that will change. The basic principles of the area and the depth, they're still there. And at the moment, the wingtips, that's what we're all finding, and that's what the current market is saying right now. Okay, your mind gone yet? Because we're just about halfway through. That was the more complicated stuff. Let's move on to the mast lengths, which is a little bit easier to understand. So this is your mast. This is what attaches to the bottom of your board and holds your foil on the top of it. Masts come in two different constructions really, aluminium and carbon. Carbon is stiffer and lighter, aluminium is a little bit more planted and definitely heavier. The advantage to carbon is it's going to give you more of a performance, and as you carve through the turn it's going to be more reactive and give you a stiffer spring back. Some performance riders prefer carbon, some performance riders still love aluminium. The disadvantage to carbon is sometimes the foils themselves with the carbon fuselages can be so light that the foils actually float up sideways on your board. So you put your board in the water and it will float like this, opposed to an aluminium mast which will sink down and obviously put your board flat. Now when you're getting into wing foiling and surfing prone foiling, that's a real pain if your board is floating up on the side all the time. It's hard to get on. Also it presents more of a risk of you hitting the foil because it's not buried in the water. The disadvantage to the aluminium is heavier, it's harder to carry down the beach, and this gives you a different feel to the carbon based foil masts. The verdict's out personally with me. I don't mind either at the moment. I'm happy riding the Axis style aluminium mast and I'm happy riding a more performance carbon mast. Again, carbon, like always, it's a bit sexier to look at and it's lighter and it's generally going to give you a little bit more performance, but the guys at Axis will probably argue that and say aluminium gives you a good different feeling of performance, and that's why they stick with the aluminium masts. So the lengths of the mast, this is a really easy one. The bigger the mast you have, the higher out the water you're going to go and the bigger the crashes are going to be. When you start off with, it's always actually better starting off with a slightly shorter mast, because then when you do come out of the water and breach, as you land back down on your board, you can have less height and there's going to be more chance you're going to stay on your board and keep riding through that breach. If you have a bigger mast and you have to go all the way up through that 85 centimeters of mast and then you crash back down, you're going to have more force and you're going to land harder, and chances are you're going to fall off, which is more time in the water. Mast lengths are available from 35 centimeters all the way up to just over 100 centimeters. A really popular sizes when you're starting off are probably 65 to 70 centimeters, and probably when you're a little bit more advanced, probably around the 80 centimeters is a good thing to look at. The advantage of using a longer base mast is that if you're using it in choppier waters or open seas, the further down in the water your foil is going to be, so the less chance of you breaching. Obviously a smaller mast, as you go over chop or swell, you're going to have to ride up and over and control that chop and swell by riding the foil in the middle of the mast. It's a little bit more technical to use, but then obviously if you do breach with this bigger foil, you've got further to come down anyway. Other things to consider when you're buying your mast is obviously if you're using it in a lake or estuary, or where we do a lot of our testing off of where we're based here, it's quite shallow water, so using these longer masts, we've got to wait for bigger tides, we've got to watch out for a few rocks, so the shorter masts are just a bit easier. So if you're going to be using it in inland lakes, shallow waters, definitely smaller masts would be better for you. So another part of the foil that's worth talking about is the fuselage length. So the fuselage is this section here that connects the front wing to the back wing, or tail stabilizer as some people call it. The longer this fuselage is, the more stable the foil is going to be in the water. The slower the turns are going to be, the slower it's going to be to react and pump, but the smoother and easier it's going to be to start off with. Therefore, if you're learning, you generally would want a longer base fuselage. And also something that we'll touch on, I'm not going to go into loads of detail about it, is the back tail wing or stabilizer. Just like the front wings, you get them in different shapes and sizes, and again, they roughly do the same thing. The bigger the tail, the more lift you will have as well, but you can also change the angle of the tail piece to change the amount of lift you get, and you get lots of different tail shapes, just like the front wing, where some go down, some are flat, some tips go up, like on the Axis here. There's loads of different things to think about. Personally, when you start off, I would not start worrying about the tail shape so much. It can get a little bit confusing. It's definitely something that I don't think you should start changing yet. Just focus really, if you're talking about the foil, at the front wing, the sizes and shape. The tail wing, yes, it makes a difference, but it's going to be a marginal difference definitely when you first start off. So now I'm going to give you two examples of people and what sort of gear, boards and foils they should be looking at. First off, let's talk about a 100-kilo person that's using it with a 5-6 meter wing in a lake. Let's say it's more of a shallow water lake. They're not interested in getting into in the surf or in open seas at all. What sort of board and foil should they be looking at? Well, they can already look at a shorter baseboard, something around 5, 7, 6 foot in length because they're not interested in paddling into surf and getting up onto their foil. They're still going to want a wide, voluminous board. They're 100 kilos, so maybe 150 litres is going to be packed with volume, something that's nice and stable to stand on, something that's got a bit of width to it. Foil wise, you're a heavier base rider, so you're going to want a bigger front wing. Definitely it's going to be 2,200 square centimetre area on the front wing of the foil itself, and the shape, you're going to be going for the more low aspect ratio, classic shape, thicker front profile with a small amount of curve that gives you a good stable feel on the water, something that's really nice and easy to use. Mast length, you're going to be in a lake, maybe shallow water, and also there's going to be less chop on that water as well, so you could go down to more of a 60 centimetre, 45 centimetre mast length. Giving that length less obviously means that when you do breach, you're not going to crash so hard, and it's going to get you up and get you learning faster. On the other hand, let's look at a 65 kilo rider that has a 4 meter wing that is going to use their wing surfing in estuaries or sea, and they want to get into SUP, surf foiling as well. What sort of gear should they be looking at? Well, definitely they should be looking at a board with a little bit more length to the other person. 6'3", 6'2", 6 foot at the shortest, because they're still going to want to paddle in and learn to SUP foil with their kit as well. Volume, yes, it can be a lot smaller than the other person, obviously because they're a lot lighter. Still maybe sitting around 115 litres, 110 litres in volume, because you want something that's nice and easy to paddle. But remember, a little bit longer in its length. Foil wise, you'll probably still keep the front foil the similar shape, low aspect ratio with a small amount of curve, big thick profile, because you still want a very easy foil to use, but definitely you're going to drop the size. You're probably going to come down to 1,500, maybe even 1,300 square centimeters in area, because you do not need that amount of lift because you're a lighter paddler or winger. When it comes to mast length, you're going to want a little bit longer mast because you're going to be using it more choppy waters and open seas, and you don't want the foil to breach all the time, but you don't want to go too long because you're learning and you have to get off the beach. So definitely something around 82, 85 will probably be a bit too big, but maybe around 70 centimeters in length would be a good happy medium between a smaller mast and a bigger mast that will be better in those choppier waters. So there we go, there's a load of information there about boards and foils. I hope it was useful, I hope it all made sense, and please, if you have any comments or questions, please let us know. I hope you've watched part 1 for on the wings. If you haven't watched that, go check that one out as well. Also look out for our SUPboarder Pro test, which we're going to be doing in a number of weeks, where we're putting all our wings into the test. I think at the moment we're sitting around 12 wings, which is a lot of wings that we have to get through, and that will only be on SUPboarder Pro, and we'll put them all head to head and give you a completely honest, impartial answer about which wings are best for which types of people. So definitely, if you're getting into winging and want to find out about wings and which one to buy in 2021, you've got to check out that video. Thank you very much for all the support so far. Give this video a like if you found it useful. Thank you very much. We'll see you next time on another SUPboarder video.